Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us here at the Philanthropy Roundtable. I'm Debi Ghate, the Roundtable's Vice President of Strategy and Programs, and we are thrilled today to have John McWhorter, Nadine Strossen, and Robert Shibley back for a second time to discuss what we can do about our culture. More about them and our program in just a moment. So for those of you who missed it, a few months ago, we hosted a webinar with this group about the intense division, naming and shaming, and cancel culture that we are seeing, and how it is that we can reclaim and restore American values. Now, what became clear in our initial discussion is that what those values are and how best to move forward is itself up for debate. And our panelists were models about how to have that kind of debate. So why did the Philanthropy Roundtable host this discussion? I mean, we're committed to strengthening a free society. We work with the largest network of donors advancing liberty, opportunity, and personal responsibility. But we as a country seem to have difficulty even talking about those things constructively today. This is one reason we recently launched a new podcast called Can We Talk About It?, where I'm hosting honest and personal conversations about tough topics. But individual efforts like that podcast are not going to be enough to address the underlying complex issues that are leading us to today's culture. We will need the guidance of those analyzing the causes and effects to help guide us. And this is why we thought it was important to bring back this group of thought leaders. So during our last webinar with them, what did we talk about? We talked about their individual involvement in 3 written statements that were issued over the summer and the fall of 2020. The Harpers Letter, the Philadelphia Statement, and the Liberty and Justice for All Statement. Now, I encourage you to listen to that first webinar if you haven't already, and we are putting the link up for that in the chat. During that conversation, here are some of the many topics that we covered. We asked, what do you think was the central message of the statement you signed? Did you disagree with anything in the statement you signed? How does language matter in these kinds of statements? And what's the difference between free speech and advocating for that and using language to silence others? Speech is involved in both. So those are some of the many topics that the group covered, and I'm sure today we will cover many, many more. One note. As we meet today, some of our friends in Milwaukee reminded us how today that community is having a particularly difficult day. The trial of the police officer at the center of the George Floyd's death began today, and the city is experiencing a very high level of tension and division, and we are thinking of them as we have our conversation today. So we are here primarily today to answer your questions. So I'd ask you to start putting them in the Q&A box. Maybe you had something from the first webinar that didn't get addressed. Maybe there's something on your mind based on the things that you've read from these three thought leaders. And we really want to take as many of your questions as we can. So please do use that Q&A box. And now on with the main program. I would ask John and Robert and Nadine to please turn on their cameras and mics. And while that's happening and you're settling in, let me quickly introduce you. So we have John McWhorter joining us. He's an associate professor of English and comparative literature at Columbia University with a PhD in linguistics from Stanford. Hi, John. Glad you can make it. John was in London virtually just a few minutes ago. So we're so happy that lightning speed travel was worked for you today.
I'm back. Yeah.
Excellent. Welcome home. All right. And Nadine Strossen is a professor at the New York Law School and past president of the American Civil Liberties Union and a strong advocate for free speech and a frequent commenter on these issues. And finally, Robert Shibley. Robert is with the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. He's their executive director and has been working on these issues for a long time, starting on the campus that he went to. So welcome, all of you. It's great to have you back. So last time we got into a lot of really nuanced issues, and it turned out that those statements provided a lot of fodder for the 3 of you to talk about where you agreed and also where you had some differences. And what was really inspiring for me, at least, was to hear you talk through these issues and sort them out for yourselves live, in front of an audience. And I think that is something that people really do want to do much more of today. And having an opportunity to hear from the three of you really helps with that process. So welcome, and let's get started. We are primarily going to take questions from the audience, but I do have one that I think I'd like to start with to help transition from our last discussion to this one. So since we last talked together as a group, what have been the important developments from each of your perspectives? How have those affected your assessment of the situation in our culture today and your recommended responses? So what's developed in each of your own thinking? And I'm going to start with Nadine. Nadine.
Thank you so much, Debbie, and it's a delight to be back with John and Robert and all of the Philanthropy Roundtable audience members. Thank everybody for their great work. January 6th occurred after our December get-together at the end of December, and that has been an instigation, no pun intended, for further crackdowns on free speech and further pressures both from government and from the private sector. So let me start with, I'll use law schools because I am a law professor. I speak very frequently on law school campuses. And I am particularly distressed at the attempt to muzzle anybody who was not only in the Trump administration, but complicit with it. It would be disturbing in any avenue, but especially at law schools where the whole professional training involves engaging with differing perspectives and being able to articulate and debate differing perspectives. I will use my alma mater as an example, but it is only an example. At Harvard Law School, there is a petition signed by many faculty members and many students demanding that nobody who had any association with either the Trump administration or with January 6th events be allowed to have any role on campus at all as a guest speaker, and certainly not as a visiting professor. This to me is blacklisting. It's bringing back the worst of McCarthyism, and it is completely inconsistent with a good education, let alone with First Amendment principles. Let me mention just one other example. Unfortunately, there are many. An organization that is very pervasively represented at law schools around the country is the Federalist Society, FedSoc for short. It was formed in the 1980s at a time when its founders thought that the law school culture was overwhelmingly to the left. Little did they know what would occur now, multiple decades later, when I think that trend is even more extreme. But from the beginning, the Federalist Society was, which describes itself as a group of conservatives and libertarians, was devoted to bringing different perspectives about issues of constitutional law and civil liberties to the law school community in particular, to change the culture. From the beginning, I have been one of the most frequent speakers at those events, right? Because they want to have different perspectives. And the Federalist Society also requires not only that there be at least one speaker with a different perspective from the invited FedSoc speaker, but also that other student organizations be co-sponsors. In my dozens and dozens and dozens of talks for campus FedSoc groups, it has always been co-sponsored by the ACS, the American Constitution Society, which is, the left-wing version of the response to the Federalist Society that was founded a bit later. If there's a campus ACLU, they co-sponsor women's organizations, minority student organizations. It's always been a wonderful way to bring together different groups on campus and different outside speakers. For the first time ever, I have run into a brick wall starting this calendar year, where campus after campus, Nobody, no other student organization will co-sponsor with FedSoc. This happened with Robert's colleague, Greg Lukianoff, the head president of FIRE, and I were speaking at Duke Law School just last week. And both the ACLU refused to co-sponsor. Former national president of the ACLU, Greg Lukianoff, worked for the ACLU when he was a student. I mean, we were two liberals. But just because the FedSoc itself is seen as complicit with the Trump administration, and the allegations are so extreme. The Duke Law School the next week was hosting an event basically blaming the Federalist Society for the insurrection. Why? Because Josh Hawley, when he was a law student, was the president of his law school's Federalist Society. So we're talking about guilt by association to the nth degree. One student desperately called me from Seattle University Law School. She's the president of the FedSoc there. There's an effort to decertify it as a campus organization. So I'm really, really distressed at again, violations of core principles of civil discourse and of education, and especially permeating what is going to be the future leadership of our legal profession.
Wow. So Nadine, since we last talked, you're right, January 6th happened. And thank you for sharing what is actually happening on campus. I know a lot of people care about what is happening on campus. I hadn't heard of some of these specifics, Nadine, and it is surprising that even you and Greg were unable to secure interest from other student groups. That is definitely concerning.
They were interested, believe me, they were interested in making a statement about stock. That was
yes.
important.
Yeah. All right, Robert, what are you seeing? Similar or different from Nadine?
No, in terms of January 6th stuff, we have seen a number of cases come across from students who are being punished for, generally speaking, being in the vicinity of the Capitol, or that, claiming, I don't know that we've had any that actually claimed that they were inside the Capitol or engaging in unlawful protests that day. Obviously, most people that day were not in the Capitol. There were a lot of people there, thousands of people for the march. And most of them didn't engage in unlawful activity that I know of. As we've sort of come to expect, universities aren't necessarily making that distinction, whether it be, through photos that show people sort of in DC on that day that are, from Instagram or whatever. So they've got the date and time and things like that on there. I think the main real change that I see coming out of the January 6th stuff is this sort of, it's seeming like release of what I didn't even realize were even more pent up demand for all kinds of censorship. Last week, we saw the Dr. Seuss apocalypse, for instance, where, Dr. Seuss went from, being a beloved children's author to someone whose 6 books not only are no longer being sold by Dr. Seuss's organization, but can't get them on Amazon. Even eBay has said that they won't let you sell your used copies, and apparently they've said that they will be they will punish your account if you attempt to sell them. So it's not just that you can't sell them; it's that you might personally be blocked from eBay if you're a merchant or just some average person who wants to sell these books. The real danger there, I think, is I feel like a dam has broken in terms of there's no longer distinction being made here in terms of if you can block, and I think that I saw it on Mulberry Street from being sold on eBay and Amazon and basically anywhere, books are sold. Is there any principle left that's preventing you from saying, I'm not going to sell the Bible, or I'm not going to sell the Quran, or I'm not going to sell any number of other books that, frankly, at this point, the only reason they're still being sold is because they're the winners of a popularity contest that Dr. Seuss and some of his books just lost. And so I think culturally speaking, that's been really jarring for a lot of people that I know. And I do think that is sort of the knock-on effects of what happened on January 6th. in some better news, one of the things that Fire is launching to sort of start to push back on this, unless you want me to get in this later, is in the middle of this month, around March 15th, we'll be launching the Fire Faculty Legal Defense Fund. And this is a program that's funded by the Stanton Foundation, which is a very prominent supporter of First Amendment causes. And we will be in a position to, if you are a faculty member or instructor at a public college or university, and you are facing a cancellation attempt, or I'm just going to go ahead and use that, even though I know it's a sloppy term, a cancellation attempt that you reasonably think might cost you your job or have some adverse impact on your employment, that Fire will actually find you an attorney and pay for that representation. So we're hoping that will be a real sea change in terms of making it so faculty members aren't so scared to speak out. They know that somebody's in their corner. Today, also, I saw the announcement from Professor Robert George at Princeton, and I think around 200 fellow professors, two of whom I may be talking to here of the Academic Freedom Alliance, which is kind of a NATO of free speech for faculty members on campus. They will also be helping to represent professors who are members of the AFA legally if they get in trouble, and coming to their defense, I think, with moral and intellectual support and statements in their support if members are attacked for those sorts of things. So those are two, I think, really positive things that are just starting this month. And both of those, I think it's fair to say that are a response to the movement we've seen probably really starting to pick up last year, but which is obviously accelerated since January 6th, to really police the speech of faculty in a way that is, sort of wildly more vigorous and dangerous than even the last 20 years that we've seen that Fire has been in existence. So I think we are starting to see the resistance. There's another word it gets overused, but to this sort of culture pickup, and I think that's some really good news. But I don't want to kid anyone. This is going to be a huge fight, and those people who are pushing for continued recognition of free speech and academic freedom are definitely on the defensive.
Definitely. So, Robert, I like the way you put that. Unfortunately, we had a couple of dams burst in 2020, and here we are in March 2021. And what you're describing to me is we had another dam burst in January, and there are now effects that are trickling down. And it is interesting to think that the positive developments are both defensive. Yeah. Which tells you where we are. Our positive developments are in effect defensive. So, John, how about you? What has developed for you since we last met?
Well, I would say that in addition to everything that's been said so far, I've been struck by an obstacle that we're going to have with a lot of people who at least call themselves sensible, which is that there's an idea that what happened at the Capitol is more important than any possible excesses that are happening on the left. So the idea is people were running up the Capitol steps, they had guns, they had Confederate flags, some of them were openly racist. And the idea is that demonstrated that there's a certain roiling, physically violent kind of rot that is the most acute danger to the polity right now. And that anybody who's concerned about the sorts of things we're talking about is concerned with mere trivia, with a few successful people who don't like being criticized, et cetera. And that's a perspective that I think we need to keep in mind, because what these people are saying is that America's intellectual, artistic, and moral culture is less important than a certain conglomeration of stridently ignorant people who did a really nasty thing in Washington, D.C. on one particular day and might want to do more. And of course, the grand question is, which type is taking over institutions? And so, yes, there are these QAnon / right-wing militia sorts of people, and gosh, we wish they didn't exist. And God hopes they won't do anything more extreme. But the thing is, what are they changing? And so what institutions are working to their tune? And the issue is not, of course, what are some conservative institutions? We're not talking about conservatives. We're talking about crazies, frankly. And who is going along with them, as opposed to the sorts of things we have seen just recently, such as poor law professor Jason Kilborn at the University of Illinois in Chicago, who is doing a law school exam, and he is referring to a case of incendiary language, and he writes N and then 5 asterisks, and we know what that means, and then another word was asterisk that way. And just in passing, because you're going to encounter these sorts of things in cases about, say, speech discrimination. And a certain group of Black students pretended that it really hurt them to even see this on a piece of paper, and got that man physically banned from campus and relieved of his administrative responsibilities. His entire career was interrupted. They apparently partly because of the social media outcry. And I think we should remember that there are good things about the effect of social media. Because of the outcry, they relaxed a lot of this and let him back onto campus and let him do his duties again, but they're still after him, is the thing I hear from him. They're still trying to pull things. They're still, quote unquote, investigating what happened when obviously nothing happened, but they're after him. Another example that I find particularly chilling is at Princeton, Joshua Katz, classics professor, dared to criticize the famous Princeton letter from last summer, claiming that the campus is a racist institution. And he said some things that frankly were not especially incendiary about how he didn't agree with the premises of the letter. And not only was he deprived of a certain honor by a society separate from the campus that he had been given, but it was as if a certain shoe that you thought wasn't going to drop finally did. Once it became clear that you can't fire him for saying those things, the student newspaper did a searing, nasty expose about aspects of his personal life, which are probably unfortunate, that most of us are, we can't help but think, gosh, maybe he shouldn't have done those things. However, they did it directly because they wanted to get him. That's spelled G-I-T. So the idea is, if we can't fire you for saying these things about the Princeton letter, and all he did was say things. It's not like he, tried to make anybody not say anything. He just said, this is what I think about the letter. If you're going to say that, then we are going to try to destroy you personally if we can't deprive you of your job. And this is things that people are doing who are perfectly sensible, who think of themselves as on the side of the angels, who think of themselves as doing the right thing. And one example like this after another comes over my transom and my sparring partner Glenn Lowry's transom. All that has become normal, and it's clear that this vision of things is taking over our institutions of instruction and culture and justice. And yet, a great many people who are involved in this are going to think that we are niggling over trivia because some people broke into the Capitol and said that they wanted to lynch Mike Pence. I think that there's no comparison between the two. I am more worried about what's going on the left, but a lot of people on the left in this suddenly become very unintellectual people. Suddenly it doesn't matter that universities are being turned upside down. That doesn't matter. Imagine that being said in France, or at least until roughly 3 or 4 weeks ago. There's no way that people who consider themselves ahead of the curve would actually claim that what's going on the left now doesn't matter, unless there was something larger going on, which is a religious impulse that they feel very deeply. But that has struck me. January 6th happens, and there are people who immediately thought that's the real problem. And frankly, I don't think it is.
Well, the real problem that is at issue with January 6th is a threat to democracy. But John, if I can paraphrase what you're saying, and I fully agree, what we are talking about is a threat to democracy.
Another one, yeah.
Much more serious and much more pervasive because it is supported by mainstream, powerful institutional actors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the problem. And so, yeah, we have to be careful how we frame the debate, I'm thinking, as we move forward.
Yeah, John, your point, which Nadine reiterated about the change at the institutional level and where is that really happening? There is a reason all three of you are bringing up the universities. There is a reason that all three of you are bringing up intellectual direction of the country. And yes, there is something very, very important at the institutional level that's not being discussed. And so here we are bringing you here to talk about this. So we are getting lots of questions in from the audience. I do want to turn to that next, but in the last few minutes of the conversation today, I'll like to circle back. I'll giving you warning now. I'd like to circle back and ask each of you what you think the path forward is. I mean, you all signed these statements last year. It almost sounds like they need to be re-released in even stronger terms. And so at the end, I'd love to hear sort of where you think the path forward needs to be given where we are now. So shall we turn to some audience questions and see what they want to know? Okay, so here's one question. Now, this is taking it out of the campus context and bringing it into business. Increasingly, companies and also public agencies are mandating racial sensitivity sessions and mandating policies for their employees. How do we protect the rights of employees who disagree with these policies? And who choose not to participate in these sessions? So now we're talking about in the business and public agency context. They are bringing in more and more training around racial issues, diversity, equity, inclusion type issues. What happens to the employee who disagrees? Who wants to start?
If I can put on my law professor hat, there are very few legal rights here. Many people do not realize that the Constitution, with its protections of various individual liberties, including free speech, only is a check on government. So unless you're working for the government, you probably don't have, you have no legal protections except from two potential sources. One is statutes that will protect you against various kinds of employer discrimination. And the federal statute certainly does not protect you against discrimination on the basis of ideology. I have only recently learned that a large number of state anti-discrimination statutes do afford protection against discrimination on the basis of ideas, party affiliation, and so forth. So that might be an avenue of protection. The other potential source of protection would be a contract, including a collective bargaining agreement. It's possible that that would contain some contractual protection for free speech and free thought.
John, Robert, anything you'd like to add? Thanks, Nadine.
I think in terms of what we're seeing in sort of the newer forms of diversity or EDI, however you want to call it, training, I actually think that employers may be starting to get closer to the line of engaging in racial discrimination in a way that could be prohibited. I think I would suspect that most employer seminars and things like that are still not there, but it wouldn't surprise me if some of them are starting to cross the line into, potentially telling people that they need to treat people with a different skin color differently as a condition of employment, things like that, that arguably, and I think it's going to be tough sledding, I think, legally to make this argument, but given, the demand out there, it wouldn't surprise me if somebody has crossed this line in terms of basically requiring you to either, say things that are racist, or that are, that are arguably racist, et cetera. It wouldn't surprise me, as I think, again, some people, they try to portray it as a difference between like diversity training and like anti-racist training. And again, those are such muddy terms, but I think the anti-racist sort of ideology, such as we're seeing it now, comes much closer to, like, if the message the employer is sending is one that's actively hostile or arguably actively hostile to most likely white people or men, I could see some courts starting to say, no, you've gone too far in terms of that training and telling you that you can't do certain things, you can't speak up. For instance, I could say, one of the things that you hear a lot is, men or white men particularly shouldn't speak up as much in a meeting. Well, I can see that from an employer potentially coming to the point where, well, you're actually telling me that because of my skin color or my gender or sex, I can't fully participate, and therefore I have fewer opportunities to be promoted, et cetera, like that. I could see that starting to cross the line. So again, though, that's not something I would want to hang a lot of hats on, but I think it may be coming. And I think the traditional sort of employer trainings, like Nadine said, there's not going to be much challenge that can be made to those on the basis of racial discrimination or sex discrimination, particularly.
John?
Debbie, I would leave that with Nadine and Robert. They know
Okay.
more than I do about the infrastructure there, and I'm glad to hear what they said.
Yeah, yeah.
But hopefully employers will start to read the literature, which, as I can understand it, the overwhelming consensus is that these kinds of trainings do more harm
Don't work.
than good.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so here's another question that taps into the Dr. Seuss example that you raised. Times change and awareness changes. That is true. The Dr. Seuss books do have some content that any of us would now regard as offensive. So how can we have a rational debate and about how we edit them for modern times?
Well, for example, one thing that I don't completely understand is why it can't be that a competent artist in agreement with the estate can't alter some of those pictures in the very small ways that we're usually talking about. So for example, and to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street, I checked, I've got most of those books. I checked that this weekend. It's one thing. It's this one Chinese man where they say, and a man from China who eats with sticks. Okay, why not make him something else and then have some talented wordsmith maybe come up with some other rhyme? It wouldn't be as cute as Seuss's, but it would be something else. And then keep selling the goddamn book because it's actually a delightful romp. Why is that not even discussed? Or, and this is what I think everybody's thinking, why can't you, when your children are getting a little older and going through that story, I defiantly read my two little girls, Mulberry Street and On Beyond Zebra the other night. And you see the little quote unquote Chinaman, as people used to say. And you say, by the way, you know that is not, you think of the Asian people you know. Do you see them running around eating with chopsticks? Is that the only thing that you have to say about your friend such and such, et cetera? This was written and drawn a long time ago. And people were rude and ignorant about these things back then in a way that they aren't now. That would be a great socio-historical lesson for any child. And you say, remember, this is an old book. A lot of our books are new books. This is a long time ago. So don't pay any attention to this little man eating with the sticks, but let's enjoy the 99.9% of the rest of this that is delightful. And I wrote this morning on my Substack about On Beyond Zebra. And nobody seems to care about that one, but I had to really work to figure out what was offensive. And apparently it's mostly that they have a man sitting on a camel with billowy pants. That's all. And so that's Orientalism. You know, Edward Said wouldn't have liked it. But the thing is, the man sitting there looks white, especially to a child who doesn't know what an Arab happens to be. The man is by himself. He's not subordinated to other people in terms of power. He's happy, he's proud, and he's sitting on a camel that has antlers hanging from which are all these kind of 50s and 60s paraphernalia objects. And so apparently he's a Middle Easterner who is this mid-century white suburbanite from Detroit. And so how is that picture offensive? How is that picture going to make my girls look down upon the Muslim guy they might meet in their class? When all it is a silly picture of somebody wearing a certain kind of pants riding a camel. I find that the cancellation of that picture was just out of a kind of a craven sort of fear. And with that one, I even asked my girls, what is he? Like, and I didn't want to make it leading questions, but I wanted to see, are you thinking of him as an Arab sitting on a camel? They didn't know. They just thought he was a person sitting on a camel. They don't have that sense of the groups yet. And the thing is, once they do, then you can explain. You know, there's an awful lot to being a Middle Eastern person. They don't all ride around on camels. They don't have a vacuum cleaner hanging from their camel's horns or something like that. And I think that any of them would understand that. But instead, we're encouraged to pretend. And I think that it's we're seeing this religious yet again, where those books are going to be actually not available. I'll bet my copy of On Beyond Zebra is it's now probably worth $1,000, and I'm not getting rid of it. But no, it shouldn't be that way. And I'm actually trying to, there's one, I don't have McElligot's Pool, and now I'm trying to figure out what are the dark ways, because now I'm going to get it.
I'm borrowing it from my public library. Some public libraries are saying they're not going to
keep them, right?
Carry the books, which is really distressing. But another interesting thing is that Dr. Seuss, who had Theodore Geisel, such a long, prolific career, he clearly evolved in his thinking, and he was often attacked, and his books sought to be suppressed from the opposite end of the political spectrum.
He was a lefty, right?
In the larger context, it's a wonderful example of how we can learn and change change and grow and become more open-minded and more egalitarian and respectful.
And I think I said this a little bit last time, and I won't dwell on this too long, but I think a big change that we've seen between last year, this year, and previous years is that the censorship impulse is really starting to hit average people in a way that it didn't before. It's really become democratic. Like everybody knows Dr. Seuss. Everybody the actress from The Mandalorian who was canceled, Gina Carano. These are sort of popular things, and obviously, most of us aren't in The Mandalorian, but these are things that now people are seeing the disappearance of things with which they're very familiar. It's not this sort of esoteric, oh, there aren't enough, conservatives in the academy kind of things. It's like, well, my fourth grade daughter, they did it, they decorated their door in kindergarten. I think that I saw it on Mulberry Street. I can't get it anymore. These are things that are really bringing it home to average Americans in a way that I think mostly did not happen prior to 2020 would be my guess.
All right, so more questions from the audience. One of them is, now that this is clear, a lot of our questions and a lot of the answers have touched on race, right? That does seem to be a real lightning rod issue among all of the issues that we're talking about. And a lot of the activity that you're describing on campus is in some way or form related to concerns around race. So that is a big theme. And we have somebody who's asked a question. It's a very big topic. So I'm going to ask you to give maybe your yes, no, because version of this answer. Do you agree that systemic/institutional racism exists? And here's someone who wants to kind of get to the bottom line on this. And I'm going to start with John. John, how do you answer that question?
Yes, there are disparities in society that are traceable either historically or sometimes in terms of the present tense to discrimination against Black people, to people not prioritizing Black people over other people. There are all sorts of disparities like that, which you can title, if you want to title it, systemic racism. I don't like that name because racism is something we associate with something active and having to do with people. And it makes it seem like we should have the same response to systemic racism as we would to an individual being a racist person. But yes, those disparities exist. The problem in our current dialogue is simply that we're told there is systemic racism, i.e. these disparities that can be traced, especially usually to racism in the past, or even racism now. And so the solution is to undo the racism, stop being racist. And the simple fact is, 9 times out of 10, stopping the racism isn't going to solve that problem as it has evolved because social history is complicated. There is a major blind spot we have about social history when it has to do, as we're saying, with race in particular. We know that physics is hard. We know that music theory is hard. We know it's hard to do math. You have to work to be an artist. We know that Jane Austen is hard. We know that James Joyce is harder. We know that smart stuff is hard. We know that psychology is hard. We know that sociology is hard as long as it's about things that happened in the past to white people. But as soon as we're talking about Black people and sociology, suddenly all of it is grape soda and finger painting. And it's just as simple as that we need to get rid of the racism. It's time we stop falling for that sort of thing. And frankly, it's time we stop celebrating as intellectuals people who put that over as serious thought. So yes, there's systemic racism. What do you do about it? Unfortunately, sometimes you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. It's not always about eliminating the racism, especially when the racism was exerted by people who are now under pressure.
Nadine.
I completely agree with John. I mean, my answer is yes. And I would say, that's the easy part of the question. That the harder part is exactly what John started to discuss, which is, so what do we do about it? And above all else, what we do about it should not perpetuate racism or even exacerbate it, which I think some current trends are doing.
And Robert.
I think I kind of look at this in a different way, in that I guess I became sort of aware of this, many years ago, like what defines a system, and not to when people are talking about the United States' healthcare system. And I think calling what we have for healthcare a system is giving it way too much credit. Nobody has come through and thought of it systematically. Obviously, I think there are institutions and systems out there that are that are either driven by or tainted by racism or have it in their history. But I don't think I think when somebody says, oh, is there such a thing as systemic racism? Well, of course. I mean, the number of systems and institutions in this country is indescribably huge. And some of them are going to be run by racists, or they're going to be run, for racist reasons or tainted by it. But I think in many ways, that's kind of a gotcha question, because if the question seems to be that if there is any system or institution in America that's racist, that pollutes the entire institution of the United States or our society. And I just think it's far too broad to give a yes or no answer to that. And I think it really discounts what so many people have doing, at least throughout my lifetime, which, the massive resources that have been put into trying to turn back or to correct these sorts of imbalances. Whether or not, they've been successful is a different question. But, I went to college in the 1990s and, was Duke, for instance, systemically racist at the time? I honestly don't know. It didn't seem obvious if it was. It felt like we were making progress, et cetera. But I don't know, but there are thousands of colleges and of course, many more thousands of systems of any kind. So I think it's a little bit of a gotcha question, but I think it's a good question to ask because it is asked so much and it's sort of used as a way to say, well, if you don't say yes to this, if you say yes to this, that means you have to believe or take action in certain ways that I approve of. And if you say no, that means that you are obviously a racist. And I think that's where the sort of gotcha for that comes in. And so I don't really look at it that way.
Oh, Robert, thank you so much for describing it that way. It does, now that you put it that way, it does feel like a gotcha question because no matter which way you answer it, there's a next step to it. So I appreciate that explanation. So we are actually coming close to the originally planned end time, which was 2:45, but we have so many more questions that I want to check if the three of you can stay on for a few more minutes so we can take a few more. Does that work?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, so let's get to the next one. There have been a few questions about colleges and universities, not surprisingly. So here's one. Many colleges and universities publicly proclaim and promise complete academic freedom in teaching and research. To what extent can these promises be used to protect faculty from administrative actions in response to words and activities of which the administration disapproves? Now, this goes back to what you're all talking about is happening on campus. So what's the relationship between academic freedom in teaching and research and this administration's attempt to stifle that?
I think Robert gets first crack at this one.
Robert does get first crack.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of, in terms of protections, particularly for tenured or tenure track faculty, the written protections there are still pretty good. There are even protections built into the regional accreditors. So those are, for those who don't know, those are the bodies like the Southern Association and Middle States Association in the United States that determine, okay, it's not that you can't have a legitimate university without it being accredited, but that the classes and this university cuts the mustard to the extent that you can transfer credits to other universities. It's sort of the basic thing. And almost every university you hear of that's not for profit or very small is accredited. And they have, they require universities to make certain baseline promises of academic freedom. There's also contracts, either with unions or with faculty members. So those exist out there. Now, a lot of times they're very nebulous. I think sometimes not so nebulous, but I think what has really been lacking is the ability of faculty members to try to enforce those contractual promises. Or at public universities, there is also the Supreme Court said that academic freedom is a special concern of the First Amendment. Now, the contours of that in terms of faculty stuff are not very well fleshed out. But I think one of the reasons that AFA and FIRE's Faculty Legal Defense Fund are going to be so important is we will start to have professors who actually have representations from attorneys who are saying, actually, we're going to start holding you to your words here. You're not going to be able to intimidate this person into just going along with whatever arbitrary decision you might make. So I think there's actually a lot more gas in that. I'm going to use a horrible metaphor here. There's a lot of gas in that tank that like the straw hasn't quite been able to reach yet. And so I'd like to see a lot more of that start happening. And I think it will starting this year.
I mean, that it's a really important point that there is a big disparity between the rights that exist as a matter of law and the ones that are enjoyed in reality. I mean, that's why the NAACP was founded in the 20th century, the ACLU was founded, because these rights had existed on paper since the 18th century or the 19th century, but they're not self-enforcing. And you need people who are aware of their rights, who can speak up when they know that they've been violated, who can contact the ACLU or FIRE or the Academic Freedom Alliance. And so I'm so excited about this new initiative. FIRE was a nice surprise for me today, and I am a founding member of the AFA, John is too. I think that's so important because we've seen in some efforts to muzzle professors, both by their peers and by administrators, those professors who are able to rally support do a lot better. And so I think even in addition to the lawsuit, just having your own Twitter mob that's standing up for you is really going to make a difference, and hopefully will overcome some of the chilling effect too, give people courage prospectively.
John, do you want to add to that?
Just to say that, yeah, I think we have to understand that basically dueling Twitter mobs could serve a purpose here, because there are an awful lot of people who understand what we're saying here. And they're often afraid to say so, at least face to face with people. But I think it's slowly becoming clear that there is a critical mass of people who are not part of this censorious left. And to the extent that we feel ourselves as a body with, legal recourse where people are threatening our livelihoods, and in general, talk about hearts and minds, making a certain kind of person sitting on the fence realize that they're not a bad person if they can't find themselves getting behind all of this witch hunting. That's a lot of what I think is going to help here. And I'd be interested to see where it is in about a year. These things don't happen instantly, but I think a lot of things are so egregious at this point that they're beginning to shift the tide, because almost anybody can see something is terribly wrong. So that's my addition to it.
All right.
I think there's and I think there's an important thing for somebody to start to stand up, because I think it acts as a permission slip to people who are kind of cowed in a lot of ways, and not just on campus, but off, to sort of I wish we need to get back to that, what I thought was the sort of quintessentially American response to somebody who's telling you what you can or can't say, which is buzz off, I'm an American, this is my right, get lost and I don't care. And people are very afraid to say that now, but they say it sort of they don't want to say it publicly, but I think there's a lot of stuff bubbling there. And I think that permission slip is going to be necessary. And if we can be part of that, I think that's really important.
I would agree. There are a lot of people who are reaching out very quietly and saying, thank you for talking about these issues. Thank you for raising these issues. And to the extent that we can help them find their voices again, I think that is a positive step that we could all take together. So we have more questions about race, because I think people are probably, we don't talk enough about this. And I think this is a topic that people really are very concerned about, but also a little shy to talk about. And I understand why. So here's another question. So many times in our country, issues arise as a way to deflect from the real issue that leaders in our system do not want to address, and in some cases want to hide. So what do you believe is the driving factor behind the promulgation of the racial divide and censoring, and the overarching outcome they hoped to achieve? So what is behind continuing to stoke the racial divide, and what are they trying to get out of that?
No one's stoking it. I think
they didn't say stoking. That was my addition. So don't blame the questioner.
Okay, in general, the people who are doing this, they're not miscreants, as irritating as they are. They're operating out of a sense that their role in this society is to create a certain kind of awareness, and that doing that requires a kind of playing victim that they come to actually believe in themselves to a certain extent. They're engaging in a kind of performance art as a way of seeking a kind of identity. It's not all of, and Debbie, the way you put it is fine, but all of those expressions, playing the race card, stirring all of this stuff up, playing people against each other, none of those people, even within one another, would recognize that that's a portrait of them. However, it is performance art. And unfortunately, one of the hardest things about this is calling people, especially people who aren't white, on this kind of play acting, when they are so earnestly pretending that they are the heirs of Dr. King. That's hard. But I think part of what we're going to do in terms of permission slips is certain people, it's going to be the braver ones at first, are going to start saying, I understand that life isn't perfect, but with this, no, you're not going to take over the campus. No, we're not going to eliminate this program because you've decided that it's, it's white supremacist or something like that. But we'll have to see whether that can actually happen.
But John, I have to say, I can't do that as a white person. I just don't feel comfortable doing that.
Some will. I think it's going to be a certain personality type at first, but it's going to be absolutely necessary that some people develop the bravery. Not to say that you're not brave, because if I were white, I would.
No, I'd say I would quote you, quite frankly.
Yeah, or maybe that's enough.
Yeah.
But yeah, it has to start with people in power understanding that sometimes they're going to have to be called racist on Twitter for a while. And I'd like to see some people start, and then we'll have a Spartacus moment. I hope. We'll see.
Nadine, can I follow up on that? I'm curious. So,
well, my reaction was there, just in terms of being an effective advocate, obviously I have the right, but I do believe there is a large contingent of people who thinks that anything that a white person says lacks legitimacy because we don't understand. We don't have the experience. We haven't walked in their shoes.
Interesting.
And we have to start saying that it's not really all that mysterious. The idea that if you walked in my shoes, you'd get it. In some cases, I think we all know with these sorts of cases that we're dealing with, somebody getting a professor suspended for saying Naga in Mandarin because that sounds like the N-word. With that sort of thing, you have to say, this isn't about shoes. You're being unreasonable, and on a certain level, you know it. And then just listening to the noise and hunkering down and having some good drinks every night for a while. And after a while, that kind of person will learn that they can't get away with it as easily as they used to be able to. I think it's a necessary step that we're going to have to see.
So I would actually at this point going to let everybody know that next week we are releasing an episode of the podcast with Nadine and Ken Stern, and we're going to be talking about anti-Semitism in that podcast. And so even if we do talk about shoes, I encourage you to listen next week to what Nadine and Ken have to say about the shoes they've walked in. So I think we are now getting to the point where if I do want to circle back and get your thoughts about what we do going forward, this is the time. So, all right. So we met in December, January 6th happened. A big escalation has occurred. All of you are just as concerned, maybe even more concerned than you were in December about where we are headed. And I really do want to end on a note of what do you think we can do to go from being on the defense as we are now to start moving us in a forward direction for the future. And let's end on an optimistic, forward-looking note if we can, because everyone who's listening and everyone who's going to listen does truly care about our culture. I believe that there are a lot of people in America who want to see America get better, no matter which side of these questions they're on. So what is it that we can leave them with for the future? And Robert, why don't I start with you?
I think one thing that everybody, I mean, obviously, AFA and FIRE are working to some extent in the campus area. I think that's, if that's turned out to be a successful model, maybe it's one that could be extended into, other institutions. I don't really know how that would work, but I don't want to say that it's impossible. I think on a daily basis, I think the main thing that any individual can do is if you did not do something, if you are being canceled or somebody's going after you and you did not do something wrong, do not apologize for it. You've got to stop apologizing because that's an acknowledgement that you did something wrong. And if you don't believe you did something wrong, it's morally corrosive to you to apologize for it. And it's also harmful to other people because it sends them the message that they should say something they don't believe in order to appease, the crowd. And that is the wrong thing to do. And so the apologizing when you are not in the wrong and you don't believe you're in the wrong has got to stop.
Okay, there's personal advice for all of us. I think we all do it. Right? Nadine?
Interestingly enough, in December, we were talking about statements. Now we're talking about actions, including concerted actions by organizations. I do have to say I've given you the negative side of what's happening on campus, but the silver lining is that it galvanizes what is at first a defensive movement, but can take on a life of its own and become proactive, that there is a proliferation of student groups that are seeking to overcome all of these phenomena, some of which are coalescing in nationwide coalitions. New student publications. I was recently thrilled to learn about something called the Chicago Thinker, because there is a movement at the University of Chicago to get rid of the famous Chicago free speech principles as allegedly perpetuating racism and all the other isms and insurrection. But now this group of students has formed this free speech oriented, heterodox oriented publication. So there is pushback.
Wonderful. Yeah, you're right. We went from talking about statements to there's actually action. That is a very positive development. And John, how about you? What
I'm
do we
going to
do?
say very briefly, because talking about students, I have office hours with them roughly now, and so I have to switch over. But I think that we should always remember that the typical college student doesn't agree with this stuff. You know, it's something that is very colorful when it's put out in social media, et cetera. But this hard left prosecutorial punitive movement, my impression is that probably every other student and maybe 2 out of 3 understand that this isn't right. The question is whether they're brave enough to speak out or not. And that varies massively. And I would venture that most of them aren't. But we have to understand that we're talking about a minority of people of all colors taking over when it comes to the campus. And I think this is also true out in real life. We're talking about a reign of terror, not the way most people are coming to feel. So the question is just, what do you do about the weapons that they use? And they don't use the weapons thinking we might be right, we might be wrong, but we want it our way, so we're just going to stomp all over everybody with our jackboots. They don't think of that. They are moist-eyed and thinking that they're bringing goodness to the world. But they do it with the brickbat of calling people terrible names. So we just have to learn what our response to that is going to be among this minority of people with a very charismatic and fearsome message.
Wow. So all 3 of you talked about at an individual level what each of us can do. Robert, you put it in very, very stark terms. If you didn't do something wrong, don't apologize. If you did, the corollary, if you did do something wrong,
Then apologize.
Yeah, right. But and Nadine, you talked about what is actually happening on campus with students that we're not hearing about, and that is very encouraging. And I will have to look up what you're talking about with the Chicago Thinker. And then John, I'm glad your students get office hours with you, and that you have a direct line with them to actually understand how prevalent this is or isn't, you know, among the average student. So thank you all again for coming. I think the best thing we can do is keep having these conversations and reminding each other, not only that it's important, but providing each other moral support to keep doing this work. We need to keep engaging with a very broad range of people who believe in the same founding principles, but may believe in different views when it comes to how we go forward, right? And I think that's an important part of the conversation that maybe we try in the next iteration. So thank you again for being here. Good to see all of you. Take care.